My brother's fiancée smiled at me during the wedding and whispered, I didn't even know he had a brother. So during the toasts, I stood up, held up a photo of myself at 13, and told the entire room how my family left me at a gas station and never came back. The bride's face turned white. And 3 weeks later, she annulled the marriage. I'm 31 now, and I don't talk about my childhood much. Most people assume that means I barely remember it, like the details faded with time or got buried under adulthood, work deadlines, and the normal chaos of life. The truth is the exact opposite. I remember it too well. There's one memory in particular that never faded, not even a little. It's still sharp in my mind, like it happened yesterday, instead of almost 2 decades ago. Back in July of 2008, I was 13 years old and stuck in the back seat of our family SUV during what my parents like to call a family bonding vacation. In reality, it meant being trapped in a car for hours while my father lectured about responsibility, discipline, and how the world didn't owe anyone anything. My older brother Brandon sat in the passenger seat most of the time, occasionally turning around just to smirk at me whenever our dad praised him for something small. Brandon was 2 years older than me, and somehow everything he did was impressive. If he got a B on a test, it meant he was working hard. If I got the same grade, it meant I wasn't trying. That was just how things worked in our house. My parents had always described me as the sensitive one. I never really understood what that meant, except that it was never said like a compliment. If I got upset about something Brandon said, I was being sensitive. If I didn't like the way my dad raised his voice, I was being sensitive. Eventually, it just became my label, the quiet kid in the back seat who was expected to sit there and not cause problems. By the time the vacation was ending, everyone was exhausted. We had spent the week driving between small tourist towns that my father insisted were educational. I remember the air in the SUV smelling like fast food wrappers and sunscreen, and the sound of the tires humming against the highway while the late afternoon sun poured through the windows. My dad had been talking for almost 20 minutes about work ethic and how boys needed to become men at some point. Brandon nodded along like he always did. At some point, I reached for the cup sitting in the holder next to me. It was one of those giant gas station sodas with a flimsy plastic lid. I don't even remember exactly how it happened. Maybe the car hit a bump. Maybe my hand slipped because it was sticky from melted ice. The cup tipped over and the soda spilled across the seat and onto the floor. It wasn't some huge disaster. It was just soda, but the second it happened, Brandon twisted around in his seat and started laughing. Nice one, Ethan, he said, dragging my name out like it was a joke. My father immediately sighed in that heavy, disappointed way that made it clear I had somehow ruined everything. Without saying anything at first, he flipped on the blinker and pulled off the highway. The SUV rolled into the parking lot of a small gas station that looked like it had been sitting there since the 70s. There were only 2 pumps and a faded sign that buzzed quietly in the heat. Beyond the parking lot, there was nothing but a long stretch of road cutting through empty fields. My dad put the car in park and turned around his seat. His expression wasn't angry in the explosive way I was used to. It was worse than that. It was calm, like he had already decided something. You need to grow up, Ethan, he said. I remember laughing a little because I thought he was about to give another lecture, maybe make me clean the mess while Brandon watched. That would have been normal. Instead, he opened my door from the front using the control panel. Get out. At first, I honestly thought it was some kind of weird joke. I stepped out onto the hot pavement, still holding the empty soda cup, expecting him to tell me to grab paper towels from inside the store. The air smelled like gasoline and summer heat, and the sound of cicadas buzzed somewhere in the distance. My dad leaned over the passenger seat slightly so he could look at me through the open door. You made the mess, he said. You figure things out. I laughed again, but it sounded nervous even to me. Okay, so what do you want me to? Before I could finish the sentence, the door slammed shut. I heard the click of the automatic locks. For a second, I just stood there, confused, expecting the window to roll down or my mom to say something from the back seat. Instead, the engine revved slightly, and the SUV started moving. I remember taking a step forward like I was going to stop it, but the car was already pulling out of the parking lot. Brandon looked back at me through the rear window, and for a moment, our eyes met. He wasn't laughing anymore. His face was just blank. Then the SUV turned onto the highway and disappeared down the road. The entire thing probably took less than 10 seconds, but I can still replay every detail of it in my head. The sound of the tires on gravel as they left the parking lot. The way the heat shimmered above the asphalt. The empty feeling in my stomach as the car got smaller and smaller until it was just another vehicle on the highway. That was the moment I realized something that a 13-year-old kid isn't really supposed to understand yet. They weren't coming back. I was standing alone in the parking lot of a gas station nearly 120 miles from home. After the SUV disappeared down the highway, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced before. A few cars passed every now and then, their engines rushing by in quick bursts of sound before fading back into the quiet of the empty road. I stood there in the gas station parking lot for a long time, still holding the crushed soda cup, staring down the highway like somehow the car might reappear. At 13 years old, I still believed there was some kind of misunderstanding that maybe my dad was just trying to scare me and would circle back in a few minutes. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then an hour, and the sun slowly sank lower in the sky until the light turned orange and stretched long shadows across the pavement. Eventually, I walked inside the gas station because I didn't know what else to do. The inside smelled like stale coffee and cheap cleaning chemicals, and there was a single clerk behind the counter flipping through a magazine. I remember my voice sounding smaller than usual when I explained that my parents had left me there and asked if I could use a phone. The man barely looked at me before telling me the store phone was for employees only. His tone wasn't cruel in an aggressive way. It was worse than that. It was bored and dismissive, like I was some annoying interruption to his shift rather than a kid who had just been abandoned on the side of a highway. I stood there for a moment hoping he might change his mind, but he simply returned to his magazine and told me I shouldn't be hanging around if I wasn't buying anything. I walked back outside as the sky kept getting darker, and the realization slowly settled into my chest that no one was coming back for me that night. I didn't have a phone because in 2008 most kids my age didn't carry one yet. I didn't have money because my parents had always said kids didn't need to carry cash, and I didn't even know the name of the road we had stopped on. All I knew was that home was about 120 miles away, and that distance felt impossible to understand at 13. As the gas station closed later that night, the lights inside went dark and the clerk locked the door without even looking in my direction. The highway traffic got louder as the night deepened, mostly trucks roaring past with long trailers that shook the ground slightly each time they passed. I eventually wandered behind the building where a dumpster sat next to a patch of gravel and weeds. The smell back there was awful, a mix of rotting food and gasoline fumes drifting from the pumps, but it was the only place that felt even slightly hidden from the headlights of passing cars. I remember curling up against the wall behind that dumpster, pulling my knees against my chest, and trying to make myself smaller as the night air cooled down. Every sound felt amplified in the darkness. The hum of insects, the distant barking of a dog somewhere across the fields, and the endless thunder of trucks rushing down the highway. Every time a vehicle slowed down near the station, my heart jumped because part of me hoped it was my parents returning, but each time the sound faded and nothing changed. Sleep came in short, uncomfortable bursts. The gravel dug into my side, and the smell of the dumpster made my stomach turn, but exhaustion eventually forced my eyes closed for a while at a time. I remember waking up repeatedly during the night, confused for a second before the memory of the car driving away settled back into my chest like a weight. By the time the sky started turning pale with the first hint of morning light, my entire body felt stiff and cold and unreal. When the gas station reopened early the next morning, a different employee unlocked the door. I waited a while before going inside because I was embarrassed by how dirty I must have looked after spending the night outside. My clothes smelled like trash and dust, and I could feel dried tears on my face even though I didn't remember crying. Near the side of the building, there was an old payphone mounted to the wall. I stared at it for a long time because it was the only thing I could think of that might help. I didn't have coins, but I remembered that some calls could be made collect if someone accepted the charge. The harder problem was figuring out who to call. There was only one adult in my life who had ever told me I could reach out if I needed help. Her name was Mrs. Lorraine Alvarez, my middle school English teacher. A few months earlier, she had pulled me aside after class when she noticed I seemed unusually quiet one day, and she told me that if I ever found myself in trouble or needed someone safe to call, I could contact her. At the time, I had nodded politely because I didn't think I would ever actually need to do that. Standing in front of that payphone, that memory came back to me clearly. I still knew her number because she had written it on a small piece of paper at the end of the school year and told me to keep it somewhere safe. I had folded it into the back pocket of my wallet and never thrown it away. My hand was shaking when I dialed the number and waited through the ringing. When she answered, hearing a familiar voice almost made me break down right there. I tried to keep my explanation simple, telling her that my parents must have accidentally left me at a gas station during the trip and that I needed help getting home. Even at 13, I knew the story sounded strange, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line after I finished speaking. She didn't challenge the story. She simply told me to stay where I was and said she would come get me. It took her almost 2 hours to arrive. I spent that time sitting on the curb near the payphone, watching cars pass by and feeling strangely detached from everything around me. When her car finally pulled into the parking lot, I recognized it immediately, and the relief that washed over me felt overwhelming. Mrs. Alvarez stepped out of the car quickly and walked toward me with a worried expression. She didn't interrogate me or raise her voice. She simply asked if I was okay and told me to get in the car. During the drive back, she asked a few gentle questions about what happened, but when I repeated the story about my parents forgetting me, she didn't argue with it. She nodded quietly in a way that made it clear she didn't believe that explanation at all, but she also understood that I wasn't ready to say anything else. When we finally reached my neighborhood and her car pulled up in front of my house, my stomach tightened again. Part of me expected chaos inside, maybe panic or relief or some kind of emotional reaction after realizing their kid had been gone all night. Instead, when I walked through the front door, the house looked exactly the same as always. My mother was standing in the kitchen, wiping down the counter. She glanced at me briefly and said in a casual tone, "That took you long enough." From the living room, I heard Brandon laugh under his breath, like the entire situation was some kind of private joke. My father sat on the couch watching television and didn't even turn his head when I came in. No one asked where I had been. No one asked if I was safe. In that moment, something inside me shifted in a quiet but permanent way. I was still standing in the same house with the same people I had lived with my entire life, but the feeling of belonging there disappeared completely. That was the exact moment I stopped believing that I actually had a family. After that day, something inside me quietly shut down, not in a dramatic way that anyone around me could easily notice, but in a slow and deliberate way that made it easier for me to exist in that house without expecting anything from the people inside it. I stopped trying to explain myself, stopped reacting to the comments Brandon threw my way, and stopped hoping that my parents might eventually realize what they had done. The night behind that gas station had made something very clear to me, and once that understanding settled into my mind, it never really left. I was on my own, even if I technically still lived under the same roof as them. High school became something I treated like a long waiting room before real life could finally begin. I kept my head down, avoided arguments, and focused on staying invisible. My father still delivered his lectures about responsibility and discipline, but by then I had learned the easiest way to survive those moments was to nod quietly and let his words pass over me without reacting. Brandon continued to be the golden child of the family, the one who received praise for every achievement, while my existence was mostly treated as an afterthought. Instead of fighting that dynamic the way I had when I was younger, I simply stepped out of it emotionally. The one thing I did take seriously was school. Not because anyone at home pushed me to succeed, but because I understood that education was the one realistic path out of that house. I spent most of my afternoons either in the school library or working small part-time jobs so I could start saving money. While other kids talked about weekend plans or family vacations, my mind stayed focused on a single goal that felt both distant and incredibly important. I needed to leave. By the time I turned 18, I had already made my decision. There was no dramatic confrontation and no emotional goodbye. I packed my belongings into 2 duffel bags, loaded them into the back of a used car I had purchased with money from working evenings and weekends, and left the house early one morning without making a scene. My parents were awake when I walked out the door, but none of them tried to stop me. My mother simply reminded me to lock the door behind me. My father barely looked up from the newspaper. Brandon made some sarcastic comment about how long I would last on my own before crawling back. I never crawled back. The first few years after leaving were not easy, but they were mine. I enrolled in a community college because it was the only option I could realistically afford, and I worked multiple jobs to cover rent, tuition, and basic expenses. Some weeks I slept only a few hours each night because I was balancing classes during the day with late shifts at a grocery store and occasional freelance computer repair work. It was exhausting, but it also felt strangely freeing because every step forward belonged entirely to me. During those years, I discovered that I had a natural talent for programming. I had always enjoyed computers when I was younger, but once I started taking more advanced classes, the subject quickly became something I pour my energy into completely. After finishing my time at community college, I managed to transfer into a university across the country in Seattle, Washington. The distance felt important to me, like placing an entire continent between my past and whatever future I was trying to build. Moving to Seattle felt like the true beginning of my life. I changed my phone number shortly after arriving, cut the last remaining threads that connected me to my parents, and never gave them a way to contact me again. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who knew me only as the person I was becoming rather than the kid I had been growing up. I made friends who shared my interests, people who cared about late-night coding sessions, bad coffee, and long conversations about technology and ideas. Over time, the chaos of my childhood began to feel like something distant, almost like a story that belonged to someone else. After graduating, I was hired by a small but growing software company in the city, and within a few years my career stabilized in a way I had never really imagined when I was sleeping behind that dumpster at 13. I moved into a comfortable apartment, built a routine around work and friendships, and slowly allowed myself to experience something I hadn't felt for most of my younger life: peace. A few years later, I adopted a rescue dog from a local shelter. He was a nervous mixed breed with uneven ears and cautious eyes that followed every movement in the room. The shelter staff told me he had been found wandering near an abandoned building and had trouble trusting people at first. I named him Buddy, partly because the name felt simple and partly because it captured the quiet companionship I hoped we could build together. Over time, he settled into the apartment with me, gradually learning that he didn't need to be afraid of every sound outside the door. Days turned into years, and those years slowly formed a life that felt stable and real. I built strong friendships with coworkers and neighbors, spent weekends exploring different parts of the city, and developed the kind of daily routine that made everything feel calm and predictable. My past became something I rarely thought about, not because I had forgotten it, but because it no longer seemed connected to the person I was now. For a long time, I truly believed that chapter of my life had closed permanently. Then one afternoon, more than a decade after I had left home, I returned to my apartment building after work and checked my mailbox in the lobby like I always did. Most days it contained the usual mix of bills, advertisements, and random flyers. That day, there was something different sitting at the back of the box. It was a thick envelope, heavier than the rest of the mail, with my full name written across the front in handwriting that sent a strange chill through my chest the second I saw it. I recognized it immediately. It was my mother's handwriting. I stood in the lobby of my apartment building holding that envelope for several seconds before I even moved. The paper was thick and expensive, the kind of envelope that felt deliberate and formal rather than casual. My name was written neatly across the front in handwriting I had not seen in more than a decade, yet I recognized it instantly. My mother had always written in the same careful cursive style, every letter rounded and precise like she had spent years practicing it. Seeing that handwriting again, after 13 years, sent a strange wave of tension through my chest, the kind of feeling that appears before your mind has time to process why. I carried the rest of my mail upstairs and set everything down on the small kitchen counter in my apartment. Buddy padded over from the living room, his nails clicking lightly on the floor as he investigated the unfamiliar envelope with cautious curiosity. I stood there staring at it for a moment longer before finally sliding my finger under the flap and opening it. Inside was a formal wedding invitation. The card itself looked like something pulled straight from a luxury magazine. Thick cream-colored paper with gold lettering announced that Brandon Parker would be marrying Madeline Whitaker. Beneath the names were the details of the ceremony, the reception venue, and a dress code that specifically mentioned formal attire. There was also a small card directing guests to an RSVP website, along with information about accommodations and transportation for the event. The entire presentation felt polished and expensive, designed to communicate a very specific image of elegance and success. It was the kind of wedding invitation meant to impress people before they even arrived. Tucked behind the formal card was a smaller piece of paper folded neatly in half. The moment I saw the handwriting again, I knew exactly who had written it. The note from my parents was short. They wrote that they hoped I would attend the wedding because it would mean a lot to the family. The message was phrased in a strangely casual tone, as if we were relatives who had simply lost touch over the years rather than people who had not spoken in over a decade. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the silence that had stretched across 13 years, and no explanation for why they had suddenly decided to contact me now. I sat down at the kitchen table with the invitation still in my hands, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. For 13 years, my parents had behaved as if I simply didn't exist. There had been no birthday calls, no attempts to reconnect, no letters asking how I was doing or where life had taken me. I had changed my phone number when I moved across the country and never heard from them again. Yet now, out of nowhere, I was receiving a formal invitation asking me to attend my brother's wedding. The more I stared at the gold lettering on that card, the more surreal the entire thing felt. Brandon and I had not spoken since the day I walked out of that house at 18. Our relationship had never been particularly warm, even before that, but after everything that happened, I had completely removed him from my life along with the rest of the family. And yet here, I was holding an invitation to stand in the same room with all of them again. Curiosity eventually pushed me to open my laptop and search for more information about the wedding. The RSVP card listed a website address that contained additional details about the event, and after a moment of hesitation, I typed it into the browser. The website loaded into an elaborate page filled with professional photos and carefully written descriptions about the couple. At the top was a large picture of Brandon and his fiancée standing in a vineyard at sunset, both of them dressed in stylish clothes while smiling at each other in the kind of effortless way that appears in engagement photos. Below the images was a section titled Our Story. I read through the page slowly while a strange sense of detachment settled over me. The story described how Brandon had built a successful career back in our hometown and how he eventually met Madeline Whitaker through mutual friends. It talked about their shared love of travel, their supportive families, and the strong values they had both grown up with. That part made me pause. The more I read through the website, the more obvious it became that Brandon had constructed a very specific narrative about his life. The descriptions talked about a close-knit family environment, parents who encouraged success, and a childhood filled with support and guidance. It was a polished version of reality, carefully written to present an image of stability and warmth. Anyone reading that page would assume he had grown up in the kind of household where siblings supported each other and parents provided unwavering encouragement. My name did not appear anywhere in the story. According to the version of events displayed on that wedding website, it was almost as if I had never existed at all. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen for a while, letting the realization settle in fully. Over the past decade, Brandon had not simply ignored what happened between us. He had rewritten it. He had built a version of the past that erased the uncomfortable parts and replaced them with something that looked clean and admirable. The wedding itself was scheduled to take place at an upscale vineyard resort outside our hometown. The website featured photos of the property, rows of grapevines stretching across rolling hills with a large stone building overlooking the landscape. Everything about the event looked expensive and carefully curated, the kind of place chosen specifically to create the perfect atmosphere for photographs and social media posts. It was very clear what kind of wedding they were planning. It was meant to look perfect, I closed the laptop slowly and looked back at the invitation resting on the table in front of me. For 13 years, none of them had cared whether I was alive or dead. Yet now, they suddenly wanted me present for one of the most important days of Brandon's life. They wanted me there to stand quietly in the background while they celebrated a carefully constructed image of a happy family. For a long time, I simply sat there in silence while Buddy rested his head against my leg. At some point, a very specific thought settled into my mind. If they wanted me to show up, then I would. Once the idea settled in my mind, I approached it the same way I approached difficult problems at work, by breaking it down calmly and planning every step with patience and precision. I didn't rush into anything emotional or impulsive. Instead, I treated the situation almost like a project, something that required preparation and attention to detail. If I was going to show up after 13 years of silence, I wanted the moment to happen exactly the way I intended. The first thing I did was respond to the invitation. The wedding website had an RSVP section, but it also listed a contact email for the couple in case guests had questions or special requests. I used that email instead of the public form because I wanted a little more control over how my response would be handled. The message I wrote was simple and polite. I confirmed that I would be attending the wedding and listed my name clearly so there would be no confusion about who the response came from. At the end of the message, I added one small request, asking that my attendance not be mentioned ahead of time because I would be traveling a long distance and preferred to arrive quietly. I didn't explain anything beyond that. A few days later, I received a short reply thanking me for confirming and letting me know my name had been added to the guest list. Whoever was managing the emails had no idea what that name actually meant. After that, I began preparing for the trip itself. The wedding website listed several hotels near the Vineyard Resort where guests were encouraged to stay, including one luxury hotel that appeared to be hosting most of the wedding party. I booked a room there without hesitation. If I was going to attend this event, I wanted to be fully present rather than hiding somewhere on the outskirts. Next, I bought a suit. For most of my adult life, I had only owned a few basic suits for work events or formal meetings, but this felt different. I went to a tailor in Seattle who specialized in custom fittings and spent an entire afternoon choosing fabric, getting measured, and discussing small details that I had never paid much attention to before. The result was an elegant charcoal suit that fit perfectly, paired with a crisp white shirt and a dark tie that looked understated but sharp. The whole process felt strangely calm, almost ceremonial in a quiet way. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about walking into that place with complete confidence. A few days before the flight, I started packing my luggage, folding the suit carefully into a garment bag so it wouldn't wrinkle during travel. As I was organizing the rest of my things, I opened a small wooden box that had been sitting in my closet for years. Inside that box was a photograph. The picture had been taken a long time ago, shortly after the night that changed everything. Mrs. Alvarez had taken it the morning after she picked me up from the gas station. In the photograph, I was standing near the edge of the parking lot with the building visible behind me, my clothes wrinkled and my expression tired but strangely steady. I remembered feeling numb when she took that picture, like my mind hadn't fully processed what had happened yet. Years later, she mailed me a copy of that photograph, along with a short handwritten note. The note contained only 2 words. "You survived." I had kept that picture ever since. Holding it again brought back a wave of memories I usually kept buried somewhere deep in the background of my mind, but this time the feeling wasn't overwhelming. It felt more like looking at a distant version of myself, a younger person who had endured something difficult and somehow kept moving forward. After a moment, I slipped the photograph into the inside pocket of my jacket. The day of the flight arrived quietly. Buddy stayed with a close friend of mine who had watched him before during work trips, and by late afternoon, I was sitting on a plane headed back toward the state I had left behind more than a decade earlier. During the flight, I spent most of the time looking out the window, watching the landscape shift beneath the clouds while thinking about how strange it felt to return after so many years. The next morning, I drove from the airport toward the Vineyard Resort listed on the invitation. The property appeared exactly the way it had in the photos on the website. Rolling hills stretched across the landscape, rows of grapevines forming neat patterns across the fields while a large stone building sat at the center of the estate. The place looked expensive in a quiet, confident way rather than the flashy kind of luxury designed to draw attention. After checking into the hotel and leaving my luggage in the room, I decided to take a walk around the property before the evening. The wedding itself was scheduled for the following day, but the rehearsal dinner was already underway when I reached the main terrace overlooking the vineyard. Soft lighting had been arranged around the outdoor seating area, and groups of well-dressed guests stood near tall tables holding drinks while talking and laughing. For a few moments, I stayed near the edge of the terrace, observing the scene without announcing my presence. Then I saw them. My parents stood near the center of the gathering speaking with a small group of people who appeared to be relatives of the bride. Time had changed their appearance in subtle ways. My father's hair had turned mostly gray, and his posture seemed slightly stiffer than I remembered, while my mother carried herself with the same careful composure she had always maintained. Even after all those years, they still projected the same quiet confidence that suggested everything in their lives was perfectly under control. Brandon stood nearby with his fiancée. He looked older too, of course, but the familiar traits were still there. The same posture, the same way he carried himself like the center of attention in any room he entered. For a while, none of them noticed me. Guests moved across the terrace laughing and talking while the sun slowly lowered toward the horizon, casting warm light across the vineyard. I stood there calmly, hands resting in the pockets of my jacket, watching the scene unfold with a strange sense of distance. Eventually, Brandon turned his head in my direction. For a brief moment, his eyes moved past me the way people do when scanning a crowd. Then he looked again. The change in his expression was immediate. His face froze in unmistakable shock as he realized exactly who was standing across the terrace. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of calm, bright weather that seemed designed specifically for photographs. Sunlight spread across the vineyard hills in long golden lines, and the air carried that quiet stillness that comes before a large event begins. I woke early in the hotel room and spent a while sitting near the window, looking out at the rows of vines stretching across the landscape. For a long time, I had imagined what it might feel like to see my family again after all those years. But the truth was that the emotions I expected never really arrived. What I felt instead was a steady, controlled sense of clarity. I put on the suit I had prepared, adjusting the jacket and tie carefully before leaving the room. The photograph remained in the inside pocket where I had placed it the night before. Feeling its presence there created a strange sense of balance, like carrying a quiet reminder of where everything had started. The ceremony was held outside on a wide lawn overlooking the vineyard. White chairs had been arranged in long rows facing a decorated arch covered with flowers and greenery. A small string ensemble played soft music while guests slowly filled the seats, their voices blending together in low conversations that drifted across the warm air. The entire setting looked like something lifted directly from a wedding magazine, every detail arranged with careful precision to create the perfect image. I chose a seat near the back rows where I could observe everything without drawing attention. Most of the guests had no idea who I was, and from that distance I blended easily into the crowd of distant relatives, co-workers, and friends who had come to celebrate. When the ceremony began, the atmosphere shifted into a quiet anticipation. The music changed, people turned their attention toward the aisle, and the wedding party began walking forward in pairs. Brandon eventually appeared at the front near the arch, standing beside the officiant while adjusting his jacket with the confident ease of someone who knew all eyes were on him. From where I sat, I could see his expression clearly enough to recognize the same self-assured smile he had worn most of his life. Then Madeline arrived, walking slowly down the aisle with the kind of graceful composure that matched the elegant atmosphere around her. The guests smiled and turned to watch, cameras and phones appearing in several hands as the moment unfolded exactly the way everyone expected it to. The entire ceremony progressed with the same polished perfection. The vows were heartfelt but carefully rehearsed. The officiant spoke warmly about commitment and family, and the guests responded with approving smiles and quiet laughter at the appropriate moments. Watching it from the back row felt almost surreal, like observing a performance rather than participating in something real. Eventually, Brandon and Madeline exchanged rings and were declared married, and the crowd erupted into applause as the music rose again. The couple walked back down the aisle together while guests stood and cheered, the celebration beginning exactly the way the planners had intended. After the ceremony, everyone moved toward the main reception area near the terrace. Large tables had been arranged under an open pavilion decorated with lights and floral arrangements, and waitstaff moved gracefully between groups offering drinks while the band prepared their instruments on a small stage. For a while I stayed on the edge of the reception, quietly observing the movement of people greeting each other and congratulating the newly married couple. Eventually, I made my way toward the family table near the center of the pavilion. My parents were seated there when I approached. The moment I stepped close enough for them to see me, my mother's eyes flickered in brief recognition before settling into a neutral expression that looked almost practiced. My father glanced up as well, his face tightening slightly before he returned his attention to the conversation happening across the table. Neither of them reacted with surprise or warmth. Their lack of response carried the same quiet indifference I remembered from years ago. For a few seconds, I simply stood there. No one said anything. It felt almost absurd to realize that after 13 years of silence, the reunion between us amounted to nothing more than a brief glance and a return to their drinks. I stepped away from the table without speaking and walked toward the far side of the terrace where fewer people were gathered. The evening light was beginning to soften as the sun lowered over the hills, casting long shadows across the vineyard. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned, Brandon was standing there. Up close, he looked exactly the way I remembered, only slightly older and dressed in an expensive tailored suit that matched the scale of the event around us. For a moment, he simply stared at me with an expression that mixed irritation with disbelief. The first thing he asked was why I had come. His tone carried the same dismissive edge I remembered from our teenage years, as if my presence at his wedding was some kind of unnecessary disruption. There was no curiosity about how I had been or what my life had become. The question existed purely to challenge my decision to be there. I answered calmly. I told him I wanted to see if he remembered the night he left me behind at that gas station. For a brief second, something in his expression shifted, but the reaction faded almost immediately. He shook his head slightly and dismissed the memory with an impatient shrug, describing it as one bad night and suggesting that I had always been overly dramatic about things like that. Listening to him say those words felt strangely confirming rather than upsetting. In that moment, it became completely clear that nothing about him had changed. The years had passed, careers had been built, and new relationships had formed, yet his view of the past remained exactly the same. To him, the entire event was a minor inconvenience from childhood, something not worth serious reflection. The casual way he minimized it revealed everything I needed to know. There had never been any responsibility taken for what happened. There had never been any understanding of what that night meant. For a moment, we stood there in silence while the music from the reception drifted through the warm evening air behind us. Then I told him I planned to stay for the speeches. After that, I turned and walked back toward the reception area while the celebration continued around us. The reception gradually settled into the rhythm that most weddings eventually reach once the ceremony is over and the formalities begin to fade into celebration. Guests filled the long tables beneath the pavilion, while waitstaff carried plates between conversations and the band played soft music in the background. The sky had turned deep orange beyond the vineyard hills, and warm lights strung above the seating area gave the entire space a comfortable glow that made everything look even more polished than it had during the ceremony. I remained seated toward the back of the reception area, far enough away that I could observe the room without drawing attention. For a while, the evening unfolded exactly the way these events usually do. People toasted with wine glasses, laughter moved through the crowd in small bursts, and the newly married couple made their way between tables accepting congratulations from guests who wanted a few moments of their attention. Eventually, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the small stage near the band and tapped the microphone lightly to signal that the speeches were about to begin. Conversations gradually faded as people turned their chairs toward the front, the the familiar anticipation settling over the room as the formal portion of the reception began. The first speeches followed the expected pattern. A close friend of the bride spoke about how the couple met and how perfectly suited they were for each other. Another member of the wedding party delivered a lighthearted story about Brandon from college that earned several laughs from the audience. The tone remained cheerful and warm, the kind of carefully balanced emotion that makes guests feel comfortable and entertained at the same time. I listened quietly while resting one hand inside my jacket pocket, feeling the edge of the photograph folded safely there. After another toast, the MC returned to the microphone to introduce the next speaker. When he said my name, the reaction in the room was immediate confusion. Many of the guests clearly had no idea who Ethan Parker was, and I could hear small murmurs ripple through the tables as people glanced around trying to locate the person being called forward. From the head table, I noticed Brandon's posture stiffen slightly, his expression tightening as he realized what was about to happen. I stood up slowly and walked toward the stage. The distance wasn't very far, but every step seemed to stretch the moment longer as hundreds of eyes followed the unfamiliar figure approaching the microphone. By the time I reached the front of the room, the confusion had settled into an uneasy silence. I adjusted the microphone slightly before speaking. My voice sounded steady. I introduced myself simply by explaining that my name was Ethan Parker and that I was the groom's younger brother. The words immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room because most of the guests clearly had not expected Brandon to have a sibling who had never been mentioned during the entire weekend. For a moment, I looked out across the audience, taking in the rows of faces watching with curiosity and uncertainty. Then I continued speaking. I explained calmly that I had not spoken to my family in more than a decade. I said that many people in the room probably believed they understood the kind of family Brandon came from, because the story presented during the wedding described a supportive and loving household. I acknowledged that weddings are often filled with beautiful stories about childhood and family values. As I spoke, I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed the photograph I'd carried with me. The image was small but clear enough to see when I held it up. In the picture, I was 13 years old, standing in front of the gas station building the morning after my parents had driven away and left me there. My clothes looked wrinkled, my hair messy from a night without sleep, and the early sunlight cast long shadows across the empty parking lot behind me. The room became completely silent. In a calm and measured voice, I explained what the photograph showed. I described how, during a family road trip many years earlier, I had spilled a drink in the back seat of our car, and my father decided the appropriate lesson was to leave me behind at a gas station more than 100 miles from home. I explained how the car drove away while I stood there believing it must be some kind of joke, and how that belief slowly disappeared as the night grew darker and no one returned. I told them how I spent the night behind a dumpster while trucks roared down the highway, how the gas station clerk refused to help, and how the next morning I used a payphone to call a middle school teacher who drove 2 hours to pick me up. I described returning home expecting someone to be worried or relieved, only to hear my mother casually say that it took me long enough. No one in the room made a sound while I spoke. The silence felt heavy but controlled, like the entire space was holding its breath. I made it clear that I had not come to the wedding with the intention of destroying anyone's celebration. I explained that Brandon was free to build whatever life he wanted and marry whoever he loved, and that none of that had anything to do with me anymore. What I refused to do, however, was participate in a version of our family history that erased what had actually happened. I said that the story presented about our upbringing described a loving and supportive household, and that the photograph in my hand existed as proof that the reality had been something very different. When I finished speaking, I walked down from the stage without raising my voice or adding anything dramatic. The quiet in the room remained absolute as I approached the head table where Brandon and Madeline were seated. For a brief moment, Brandon stared at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief while the rest of the table looked frozen in place. I set the photograph down gently on the table in front of him. Then I turned and walked toward the exit of the reception hall. Behind me, hundreds of guests remained seated in stunned silence as I stepped outside into the cool evening air and left the celebration behind. After I left the reception hall that night, the vineyard was quiet in a way that felt almost surreal compared to the silence I had just walked out of. The warm lights from the pavilion still glowed behind me, while distant music from the band drifted through the evening air, but I kept walking past the terrace and down the path that led back toward the hotel. My footsteps moved steadily along the gravel while the sound of the celebration faded further into the background. For the first time since opening that envelope weeks earlier, my mind felt completely calm. I returned to my room, hung the suit jacket over the back of a chair, and sat by the window looking out at the dark vineyard field stretching across the hills. The photograph was no longer in my pocket. It was sitting on the head table inside that reception hall, resting in front of the brother who had spent years pretending I had never existed. The realization carried a quiet sense of finality that I had not expected. I had not shouted, threatened, or created chaos. I had simply told the truth and left. The next morning, I checked out of the hotel early and drove toward the airport before most of the wedding guests were even awake. The entire return flight back to Seattle passed in a strange blur of thoughts, but none of them felt heavy or painful. If anything, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if something that had been locked inside me since childhood had finally been released. For several days, nothing happened. Life returned to its normal rhythm. I went back to work, took Buddy on our usual walks through the neighborhood parks, and focused on the projects waiting on my desk. The wedding felt like something that had already faded into the background. Then one evening my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered anyway. The voice on the other end introduced herself quietly as Madeline. Hearing her name immediately brought back the image of the ceremony, the white flowers, and the carefully constructed atmosphere that had surrounded the entire event. Her tone was controlled but tense. She explained that she needed to ask me something directly and that she hoped I would answer honestly. There was no anger in her voice, only the kind of calm that appears when someone is trying to process a reality they had not expected to confront. She asked if what I said during the speech was true. I didn't exaggerate or add dramatic details. I simply explained exactly what had happened during my childhood, the night at the gas station, the years of silence that followed, and the moment I realized that my family had decided to erase me from their story entirely. I spoke calmly, the same way I had at the wedding, because the truth itself was already enough. There was a long pause on the line after I finished. Madeline eventually explained something that confirmed what I had already suspected. Brandon had never told her he had a brother. According to the version of his life that she had known, he had grown up as an only child in a stable and supportive household. The entire past had been carefully edited into something cleaner, something easier to present to the world. Learning the reality forced her to confront a version of the man she had just married that she had never seen before. Within weeks, the marriage collapsed. The legal process moved quickly because the relationship itself had barely begun. What had been presented as a perfect union between two successful families quietly unraveled once the truth behind Brandon's history became impossible to ignore. Eventually, the marriage was annulled entirely, bringing the entire situation to an abrupt end that few people had expected when the wedding invitations were first mailed. Not long after that, something else unexpected happened. A journalist reached out to me after hearing about the incident at the wedding through someone who had been present that night. At first, I ignored the message because I had never intended to turn the situation into a public story. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the experience I had lived through was not as unusual as people might assume. There are many families that quietly erase the members who do not fit their narrative. Eventually, I agreed to speak with the journalist. The article that followed was published under the title "The Brother They Tried to Erase." It described the events of my childhood, the moment at the wedding, and the years of silence that had existed between those 2 points. I told the story exactly the way it had happened, without dramatizing anything beyond the facts. What happened after the article was published surprised me. The story spread widely online, shared across social media platforms and discussion forums where people began responding with their own experiences. Messages started arriving from strangers who had lived through similar situations, adults who had been rejected, ignored, or quietly removed from their own families for reasons that rarely made sense. Reading those messages changed the way I viewed my own experience. Over time, I began participating in small support events organized for estranged adult children, people who were trying to rebuild their lives after being pushed out of their families in one way or another. At first, I simply spoke about what had happened to me and how I had managed to move forward, but eventually those conversations grew into something larger. The story that began with one abandoned 13-year-old kid started helping other people find the courage to tell their own. Meanwhile, the image my parents and brother had spent years constructing began to collapse under public scrutiny. The article forced people in our hometown to confront a version of events that had never been discussed openly before. The perfect picture of a respectable family quietly fractured as the truth became impossible to ignore. None of that felt like revenge to me. By the time those consequences unfolded, my life had already moved far beyond the house where I grew up. I had built a career, formed real friendships, and created a home where a nervous rescue dog could finally learn that the world was safe. The real victory had nothing to do with exposing anyone. It came from something much simpler. The quiet kid who had once been left standing alone at a gas station had grown into someone whose voice could no longer be erased.